Welcome to Podforest, where forest pros discuss forest woes. Our goal is to communicate with private landowners on a variety of forest health issues to support management and stewardship of your lands. In this podcast, we'll be discussing important topics in forest health with experts in multiple fields. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy this episode of the Proforest Podforest. All right, welcome everybody. We're in the studio today with Dr. Dave Coyle, who has blessed us with his presence here in person from Clemson University. Dave's working on a current circuit, travels a lot, and we're putting him to work here at the University of Florida. He's also got a seminar with us later on today, and I'm very fortunate to have him with us here. Dave, we really appreciate it. And for anybody listening, Dave's an assistant professor at Clemson University in the College of Agriculture, Forestry, and Life Sciences. He does a lot of stuff with forest health and invasive species, which is great for what we're talking about today. This broad question of whether or not treating for invasive species, we could think about it as, is it causing cancer? Is it saving Bambi? It kind of shows this dichotomy of this whole using pesticides to treat invasive species kind of question that a lot of people wrangle with. So, Dave, thank you, and really appreciate you being here this morning.
Thanks, Tyler. It's good to be here. I've been working with the Proforest crew for years now, so it's been a little bit since I've been in Gainesville, so it's good to be back down here in person for sure.
Yeah, we met about a little over a year ago, and then we've just kind of coincidentally bumped into each other at different conferences and be like, oh, there's Dave Coyle on the escalator. What's he doing here?
There's Tyler, yeah. So that's kind of how it works in this business as it does in any business, but it's good to be back and see colleagues and friends and have some of these conversations, because these are questions I get all the time from people when it comes to invasive species, pesticide usage. It spans the whole gamut in terms of what people are willing and able to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful point, because talking about chemical treatments and pesticides and all that kind of stuff, it's not just for forest managers or forest owners. You can see this in the backyard gardener having hesitations. Pollinator enthusiasts, beekeepers, there's all sorts of concerns across the general public really about the use of pesticides in all sorts of different fields. Pun not intended on that. And being in Florida, it seems like every other day we're talking about invasive species. Florida's a beacon of invasive species. And I think most people became pretty familiar with the concept of invasive species, in Florida at least, with the Burmese python. Those pictures of a alligator bursting out of a Burmese python's stomach, that was in 2006, I think. And as a little 10-year-old me, I thought that was pretty cool in a really macabre sort of way. As a 27-year-old, it's still pretty cool in a macabre sort of way. But I think that really starts to paint the picture and gets people interested in like, oh, there's things that are here that we probably don't want here. But I've also learned that it's not as cut and dry as that. So I think what would be great, Dave, is if we could just kind of start off and just kind of talk at a bird's eye level what exactly an invasive species is.
As with any ecological thing, there's a lot of layers to the onion, right? And so this is no different whatsoever. So when we talk about invasive species very broadly, it just simply means that something is not from here, right? And the next question that I hope I get is, Dave, what is here? I tend to think of invasive species on a continental scale. So if it was evolved in North America, if it's from North America, then it's native to North America. You can use the example, well, what if it goes from the U.S. to Canada? There's a lot of layers to that onion. What if it's native to northern Minnesota and it simply walks 50 meters and it's in Canada? Is it now an invasive species? I think most would say, no, that's not an invasive species. That's just a bug that crawled across a bunch of logs and it's in a new country, because these organisms don't see those geographic boundaries, country boundaries. Now, something that's native to Europe or Asia that gets into North America, that's a completely different thing, right? So it really depends on the scale at which you're looking at. And for me personally, I always go on a continental scale. So there's plants, there's insects, there's fungi, there's mammals. Those are kind of the four main, or I should say vertebrates are kind of the four main groups we deal with. I don't do a lot with vertebrates other than think, some of them are really cool, like you were talking about, right? Some of the pythons and all that. So I deal a lot with the plants and the insects and the fungi. And these are very different in terms of how they get here. Plants are almost always brought in here by people, right? Everyone wants the next pretty plant for their yard. They want the next big flower from wherever. They want the next beautiful fall foliage. And I can't think of a single invasive plant that we deal with on a large scale that wasn't brought here on purpose. Right? They don't just randomly float over here. They're brought in, and it's almost always horticulture type things that bring those things in here. Now, for insects and pathogens, that is kind of a completely different ballgame because those almost always arrive by accident. In the case of wood-boring things, which we deal with a lot, or which I deal with especially, those are always coming over, just kind of sneaking over as, they're inside wood things. So they might be inside a pallet or a big spool that carries wire. They're just sort of passive bystanders in the realm of international trade. And if they get from point A to point B, and point B happens to be the U.S., and they make it out of that piece of wood or that pallet, and they establish that we have an invasive species. So these things come in very different forms.
So kind of on that point, we think about the plant trade perhaps and things being intentionally brought over. A lot of the invasive plants that we see in Florida especially either started either in the sort of ornamental business because they were pretty, or they were brought over for some sort of purpose. So I wonder, though, kind of what you had mentioned earlier with a bug just crawling 50 meters into a different country. That's not really invasive. But crossing an ocean, that's a totally different thing, and that's usually human-driven in some respects, or in many respects, excuse me. But if they just show up on our shores, how exactly do they become invasive? And why is it that Florida or perhaps the Southeast can become such a hub for invasive species?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's important to know that not everything that gets here that's non-native becomes invasive, right? So there's a lot of things that are not native to here, but really just a sliver of those, a small piece of that pie actually becomes invasive. Invasive things have a few characteristics. They are very prolific in reproducing, whether that's, a plant that makes a ton of seeds or produces from sprouts and suckers, or insects with a really high reproductive rate. They typically will crowd out native species, so they're very aggressive in that type of thing. And they don't really have any natural enemies here. So those are kind of three things. And then finally, to be classified as an invasive species, that particular thing has to have some sort of negative impact, whether that's economic, ecological, human health, any of those count. Folks may be surprised to know there are many, many, many non-native species in North America that you've probably never heard of because they don't really do much of anything impactful. Now, that's not to say there's not some small ecological impacts we haven't found yet, but by and large, when you compare and contrast the big ones, the emerald ash borers of the world, right, which are killing, almost wiping out an entire genus of trees. There's lots of beetles out there that are not from the U.S. that show up in traps. We know what they are. We have no clue what they're doing. And if they've been here this long and we still don't know what they're doing, stands to reason they're not making a really big impact in any measurable way that we can find.
And that statement on impacts makes me wonder quite a bit because I'm a hobbyist beekeeper. And so I talk to beekeepers a lot, and honeybees aren't native to the American continents at all. Some would very much argue they're invasive, and that's a whole other can of worms that we don't need to get into.
We're not
here.
going to do that here.
We'd have this would go on for hours, but It's an interesting case because you also deal with Brazilian pepper, which most people would very much consider heavily invasive, very invasive, nasty thing. But you get this interesting sort of trade-off where you might be dealing with two invasive species like a honeybee and a Brazilian pepper, but people get economic reward out of it. They can sell honey. Brazilian pepper honey is very marketable, very popular, and it's a forage source during a time where might be a whole lot else. And so it becomes a sort of resistance to invasive species language. I mean, case in point, I even said honeybees aren't native. I didn't say they are invasive. I said some people call them invasive. So I think it's interesting to see these sort of shades of gray when it comes to some invasive species, but with others, it's very black and white. So for those that have particularly strong impacts where, I think a lot of people would probably say we should probably do something about this. And I know plenty of invasive species do get on the sort of radar of government agencies, public institutions, nonprofits, what have you, private landowners, of course, as well. What's that sort of, is there a sort of ethical angle to managing for invasive species? Or is it purely just, hey, this isn't supposed to be here, this is causing a problem? Is there anything beyond just that?
I think the ethical angle, and piggybacking on what you said earlier, as you go farther up the southeast coast, Chinese tallow tree, which is a super aggressive invasive tree, sort of fills that same niche as Brazilian pepper in terms of the bees and beekeepers.
Yep.
So we get a lot of tallow honey is common. It's good. It's an early season source of, everything the bees need. And we get a lot of pushback from beekeepers when we try to manage tallow because they think their bee colonies are going to collapse. The argument that I always make, and this tails into the ethical ethical discussion around all this, is those invasive species, those invasive plants, things that are clearly invasive, Brazilian pepper tree, Chinese tallow, they are only there because they have taken over spaces that could have been filled by native species that would also give those, in this case, bees, what they want. If you take, and I'll give you a Chinese tallow example, if you take out the Chinese tallow from a chunk of coastal lowcountry in South Carolina, you are going to get salix, you are going to get acer, you are going to get a whole bunch of native plants that do flower early that bees can use just as well. Those will all come back. And so it's one of those things that, managing these invasive species, it's an ecological thing for starters. And then that, of course, will piggyback onto some of the financial things, especially in production systems.
Mm. So recently, the city of Gainesville had the 10th annual Great Invader Raider Rally, where we go out and rip up just so much coral ardesia. Well, mostly we pick the berries, but it's a big effort to try and handle this population of this super invasive plant. We make dents in it every year, but it's an ongoing thing. And I find that some of the volunteers I've worked with over the 8 or 9 years I've been doing it, they usually have no problem picking the berries, because that's perhaps the most important thing. But when you start talking about either ripping up the plant or perhaps treating the plant with an herbicide, usually a foliar application in this case, there might be a little bit of hesitancy. Now, I say that with my own little bit of hesitancy because I find that the volunteers, when they go out into these sites, they see how bad it spreads. Using Ardesia as an example, it just carpets the understory, and it just crowds everything else out. So I find that when people experience it, they see it, and they actually have a role to play in the management of it, they get more involved. There's also a slightly negative, I would argue slightly negative consequence, where once they know what it is, they start noticing it everywhere. And I say that as a slight negative because it can be a bit distressing. I would say they're like, this problem is far worse than I thought it was. I thought it was just restricted to this park or maybe some of the city parks. I didn't realize, it's growing in my own backyard. So why do you think there is some pushback against the whole idea of invasive species and kind of trailing off of that pushback against perhaps some of the more heavy-handed ways of managing invasive species? Because using the honeybee as another example. So you were talking about managing for Chinese tallow. Well, we've done stuff with managing Brazilian pepper. There was some beetle that UF released not terribly long ago just to see how it would do against Brazilian pepper. And you can spend a little bit of time online and see, on social media, some of the comments that are left. And there's this thing I've heard quite a few times over the years. Anytime we talk about invasive species management, it's, well, humans are invasive too. This is nature just doing its thing. This species just shows up for some reason and it just takes off, let nature do its thing. What do you kind of think about that sentiment and where that might come from?
Oof, Tyler. So people in general fall on a bell curve. Mm-hmm. You've got a sliver on one end who are going to believe everything that a professional says. And, we are with land-grant institutions. It is our job to provide information. There's a sliver of people on the end that are going to believe whatever we say because you've got a gator on your shirt or I've got a tiger paw on my shirt. And okay, they said that's what we should do. We're going to do it. There's a big chunk in the middle, the bell portion, that are willing to listen and listen for reasons why they should or should not do something. And then there's a sliver on the other end who, regardless of what we do or say, they think it's a conspiracy of some sort, right? I think a lot of times the comments you get on things like that come from the far end where it does not matter what we did. We could save a baby and they would find something wrong with it. So I think figuring out, in terms of dealing with people, some of them you're never going to make happy. And for the rest of them, it's justifying why we are trying to do something. And I think one of the reasons I think sometimes people get pushback is it's just an education issue. At least I want to think it's an education issue, right? Whereas most people, to them, green is good, right? So even if it's a carpet of an invasive, well, look how pretty and green that is, right? If you kill all that stuff, in their minds, they're thinking it's just going to be a bunch of brown dirt. And it's because, and we know that's not what's going to happen. All the native stuff's going to come back and it's going to be green and beautiful again. But to a lot of people, they don't have the experience or haven't thought enough about it to realize that if you just get rid of the invasive, the natives come back and it's going to be better. They just see a green carpet, which they think looks nice. If you get rid of that green carpet, you're going to have brown dirt. And why would we do that to the forest? Right. And I think this is part of the mentality that's out there. And sadly, it falls on the shoulders of educators to show people what it can be, and this is something we've struggled with. It basically takes a lot of heavy-handed demonstrations, have a chunk of land where you've got something to invade, get rid of the invader in one spot, keep it in another, show them what the new stuff can look like. This is what a native forest or roadside ditch or whatever can look like if you get rid of all this invasive thing. Because people need to see that if you get rid of one green, another better green is going to come back. And I think a lot of people just don't make that connection, and it's like, it's any profession, right? I mean, it's easy for us to make because we've been doing this for years and we know how all of the things work because we've done all the classes and we've done all the work and et cetera, et cetera. It's the same as, a medical doctor can look at a chart and know exactly what's up, and where to you and I would be, it would look like a bunch of gibberish because we don't do that, right? And I think this is kind of what it gets down to, is just people just don't know what it could be. And so that unfortunately brings a lot of vitriol and a lot of comments, especially in the online stuff. And then going further, I know biocontrol it's got a long history, biological control, especially using another non-native thing to control a non-native thing. So I believe the weevils or the beetles you're talking about for pepper tree were also not from the U.S., right? Typically, that's one of those things where people will say, well, you've already got one invasive. Why are you bringing another one in here? And the problem is, decades ago when biocontrol first sort of started as a thing, I'll be honest, people were not as careful. They just found, we've got a pest from China. We went over in China and we found something that ate it. We brought it back and we let it go. There wasn't the rigorous testing to make sure that it's only going to eat that thing. They just let it go, and holy crap, what if it eats something from the U.S. and that wasn't known? So there have been some missteps in the past, and I feel very comfortable in saying that time is over. I mean, there's a very, very stringent protocol now before anything is released in the environment. I mean, it takes at least a decade to even consider something that might be used. So, I don't think there's as much of a problem now, but still there's sort of a stigma with you're releasing something that's non-native. You've already got non-native pest problems. What are you doing? And that's kind of something that, again, comes from education, and people don't realize that, folks have been studying that bug for 10, 12, 13 years already just to be positive it's only going to eat Brazilian pepper tree, right? And so those tests have been done, and then maybe it just doesn't, people just don't see the connection.
It's interesting you bring up biocontrol, and a lot of these subjects sort of start intertwining a bit. So something else with the Great Invader Raider Rally, it used to be called the Air Potato Roundup, but we had a successful introduction of the air potato beetle.
Yeah, air potato leaf beetle.
Air potato leaf beetle. That you don't see a whole lot of it in a lot of these parks anymore. Now, that's just a generalization. Like, you can still find it in some spots, no question. But they had to change their event because that beetle was so successful. So now it's focused on Ardesia, and there's no real biological control for Ardesia here in the States. It just spreads and spreads and spreads. Now, as a social scientist, the note of education has always been something that we've talked extensively about. And I've come to the conclusion, based on my own experiences in coursework and research and all that kind of stuff, that education and knowledge is certainly important. It's not to belittle it. I'm very passionate about teaching and extension, all that kind of stuff, but it is unfortunately not the silver bullet to this werewolf of a problem that we have with really prolific, real nasty invasive species. Because again, you can tell somebody something is invasive, you can illustrate all the issues that might be associated with that species, but there's usually something else that prevents more action, whatever that might be. So again, with the Ardesia removal we've done with the city, and this is certainly not to belittle that event or anything like that. I've been part of it for years. It's we remove the berries and we pull up the seedlings, and some people pull up the adult plants. But we're not spraying the plants during this event. So some could argue that it's not the most useful. Now, I'd very much push back against that sentiment, that it gets people involved and it slows down the process and progress by removing all these berries and some seedlings and whatever. It's making dents, and you also have to be realistic with what you can accomplish when and all that kind of stuff. So I'm thinking of the various tools that we can use to manage invasive species. Why would somebody perhaps gravitate more towards an herbicidal treatment rather than something mechanical or prescribed fire or anything like that?
Yeah, and you hit it when it comes to those events. Those, to me, are teaching opportunities,
Yep.
right? And we have a similar program, Bradford Pear Bounty, up in South Carolina, where if you cut down a Bradford pear tree, which leads to an invasive calorie pear tree, we'll give you a free replacement tree. I know that is not going to eliminate calorie pear on the landscape, but it gives me and my team an opportunity to talk to people when they come in there and tell them about why it's so great to plant native species and not non-native ones. So these events are great because they're a public teaching opportunity. Now, in terms of herbicide, there's a lot of different ways you can manage an invasive species, and it really depends on what species and how much you have. Herbicides don't always need to be used. If you are in a situation where you have one plant in your backyard, you can pull it up. Problem solved. You don't need to spray it with anything. If you're managing 100 acres and there's invasive privet all through there, no one in their right mind is going to physically remove that stuff, right? Your only logical option is herbicide. And I think this is where you got to think about what is the objective that you're trying to accomplish? How much land are you trying to look at, and how much land are you trying to manage? That's going to dictate a lot of what you do. And sadly, in a lot of cases, because of the characteristics of invasive species, one of which is being super hardy, one of which is the ability to resprout after basically everything, herbicide is your only logical choice to actually get rid of it. Right? You can pull it up, and I've had these, I won't call them arguments, discussions with many people. Why do you need to spray kudzu? Have you ever tried to dig up a kudzu root? It'll take an hour for one plant because it's a gnarly, big old potato-like thing way down in there. And so, at some point, you just have to look at what is logically the best way to accomplish the most in the least amount of time, or make the best use of your time and your resources. And typically the best use of resources is a chemical application of stuff. I would argue fire is maybe even better if you can run a fire across stuff. Now, fire is going to kill lots of the seeds typically for things. It'll also kill some of the very small seedlings. But if anything that's especially woody, these woody invasives, if they're established, a fire is just going to top kill them, right? It's going to kill the top. They're going to resprout. But that's a case where then they're going to resprout. They're going to have, in a few months, there's going to be all this good, fresh, lush foliage. That's perfect for herbicide. So, I advocate a lot of times if you have a large chunk of land, burn it first, then go back and spot treat it. And that is going to be the most cost-effective and time-effective method to get rid of that invasive. So it really just depends on what people's, what their situation is, right? And like I said, if you've got limited invasive individuals, you don't need to use herbicide. You can dig them up, smother them in black plastic and let them die out that way. There are things you can do if you've got the time, if you've got the resources. I mean, there are things you can do, but for most people that manage larger, even, more than a quarter acre, honestly, chemicals are going to be the only real thing that makes sense to get rid of those invasives.
So are there some invasives that actually respond well to fire? Like they actually enjoy being burned, for lack of a better word, enjoy being burned?
I would say most of them don't mind it at all. Yeah, I think, for most of the invasives, the seeds are a little more susceptible to fire. So you will kill some of those. There's been a little bit of research on some of that with Elaeagnus, and they showed you get a really big decline in germination rates after fire's gone over the seeds. Some of those really small seedlings, when they just start growing, are pretty fragile, and you'll be able to kill them as well. But for every invasive plant I can think of, once it's established, it's just going to resprout.
I spoke to somebody a few years ago who had mentioned that back in the day, they were very anti-herbicide. And I think the word chemical just carries a bad connotation, even though life as we know it depends on chemical reactions and chemistry and all that kind of stuff. But chemical itself is just a bad word to most people. And I certainly can't fault them for that. But this individual said, well, we were trying to manage longleaf pine savanna, and we were dealing with, oaks that were starting to encroach and just be a real pain to deal with. So we'd cut them down, but they wouldn't spray the stump. A few years later, that one oak became about 7 different oaks. And it was just that much harder to deal with. So that was kind of a hard lesson learned. And from that point on, they had mentioned we kind of learned from that experience and we realized the necessity in this case. Now, me saying that is not saying, you need to absolutely spray all the time. Kind of what you just said, depends on your land, depends on the species, all that kind of stuff depends on your resources. But I've always kind of wondered on those sorts of situations where, chemical is such a bad word to most people. How do we try and overcome that? And I've wondered this too, because we don't really use the proactive approach in the United States. We're generally pretty reactive, and we see this with a lot of herbicides that are, or not even just herbicides, just pesticides in general that are available, especially neonicotinoids and various other classifications that we kind of realize after the fact, maybe we shouldn't be using it like this. Maybe we should be using it a different way. And so I can't fault people for that sort of a approach, especially if you're treating something like a water hyacinth in a wetlands. Like that gets such a big pushback because you're spraying into the water. And that water ends up in the public's drinking water supply. So I think it's a consistent uphill battle. I think about it in just all these different ecosystems. It's always the same formula. Like it's a pretty plant. We see wildlife interacting with it in some case. Therefore, not a problem.
And part of the issue is just coverage of things, media coverage of things, right? For in pesticide, chemical pesticide, that's got a bad connotation to it because when things go sour, it's all over the news, right? When that neonic was used improperly out in Oregon, killed all the bees, holy crap, ban all the neonics.
Yep.
That was one incident, and that's maybe another story, but all the times that exact same chemical was applied properly and did exactly what it was supposed to, nobody even knows about, right? There might be one instance where someone applies an herbicide and it kills a bunch of stuff it's not supposed to. That's get plastered all over the news or all over social media, but all the other thousands of times glyphosate or triclopyr or pick your herbicide is used appropriately and does exactly what it's intended to, nobody knows about that because everything works right. It's almost like in football, if the offensive lineman, if you never hear his name, that means he did a good job, right? If you hear his name, he screwed up. And it's the same kind of principle as the bad things get magnified very, very disproportionately to all the good things that happen as well. So that's, I think, another part of it too, is just, if someone screws up, people are going to hear about it. But if you do a good job using any pesticide, no one knows.
It's interesting you say that the bad things get amplified. You could think about it in a perhaps a business standpoint or a restaurant standpoint. If you have a bad experience at a restaurant, you're probably more inclined to leave a bad review.
Right.
But you're probably not really that inclined to leave a good review.
Yeah.
Because the good should be just the default.
It should be.
Like, you wouldn't expect anything other than just, hey, we're going to have just, a good time and whatever else. Maybe if they go above and beyond, you leave a good review.
Yeah.
But the bad reviews or the bad experiences, stick out the most. And you generally remember that the next time you go to that restaurant, if you go back to that restaurant. And it's an interesting sort of situation, though, because you would perhaps logically think, well, okay, if we're amplifying the bad things, if negative things carry more weight psychologically to us, perhaps, and this speaking as not a psychologist, invasive species, we can hammer that point home of they're bad for XYZ reason, but there's still tremendous pushback, or maybe not even pushback, but apathy. So have you sort of found any ways to try and overcome that or deal with that? Have you met people that kind of fall into that camp?
Yeah, this is where it gets to, if it doesn't directly affect me, I don't care mentality. Right? And I think this happens a lot, especially with invasives, especially if you're asking the greater population to make a sacrifice to control an invasive thing. There's going to be a lot of them that say, why should I have to sacrifice? I don't have any of that on my property. Right? It's the same thing when I will equate this to when there's a new proposal to increase school taxes. You will typically see people without children not want to do that, because why do they care? Their kids are either gone, or if they never had kids, why should I pay taxes for something I'm not going to use? And it's the same kind of principle with the invasive things. You'll have a few that are very affected, that are very much pro-action, right? Let's do something. Let me help you do something, or help me do something. There's a chunk of the population that wants to help because they care about the world around them. And there's a chunk of the population that does not care because it does not affect them in their mind, even though there might be secondary effects they're not thinking of, right? Having an invasive species A might make something they want more expensive. Doesn't really directly affect them because they can't make that connection. So that's when it gets hairy and tricky. So getting the greater population to be on board, it's tricky. I mean, one thing I've learned is in dealing with invasive species, it's a lot of sociology, which I was admittedly not ready for when I got into this business, because naive me coming up just thought, well, clearly everyone's going to want to do the right thing here, which is not the case. It might come as a shock or not a shock to people. It very much depends on how they are impacted.
As a social scientist, I really appreciate that sentiment.
That's true, man. Oh, my gosh.
It doesn't take terribly long before some of the more hardline natural science people are like, oh, wait a minute. Mm-hmm. We probably need to interact with people on this in some respect. We need to probably have a little bit of understanding of sociology or psychology as well, economics, different attitudes and perceptions. And it's one of those other things where you'd mentioned property boundaries a little bit, and does a bug that walks 50 meters become invasive? Well, maybe you're a landowner and you have your parcel, and then all around you are invasive species, but your neighbors don't seem to really care for one reason or another. Maybe it's just too overwhelming, perhaps, or it's just maybe they don't know about it, or who knows. Invasive plant or invasive insect really does not care about your arbitrary property line.
I get these questions a lot. There's actually a couple in my email this morning I opened and didn't have the heart to deal with because they were going to be long explanations. But yeah, I mean, this is a common thing, the property boundaries. And one of the worst invaders, honestly, is bamboo. Someone will plant bamboo because they think it looks like a great hedge, and all of a sudden it's growing into every neighbor's property. The neighbors want it gone. The person that owns it doesn't because they like it, and it's not their problem. It's doing what they want it to. So there's a lot to unravel there, and it's tough because what a neighbor can do in this instance, right? If you've got something growing onto your property from your neighbors, what you can do really depends on the local laws. right? The first thing we always say is like, why don't you go try and talk to your neighbor and handle this like two grown adults and figure out a solution. That's your best case scenario. There's really no second best case scenario because all the other scenarios are not great. So if you can't handle it as adults, if one of the neighbor doesn't want to deal, you got to look and see what you are legally allowed to do. I can tell you can't just kill his plant or his or her plant because you don't like it on your property. And so it gets messy from there, man. But it happens all the time.
It's funny you bring that up. It's one of the sort of ending messages from the Raider rally that I've done over the last decade or so is, now you know what this looks like. If it's in your yard, you can deal with it. If you see it in your neighbor's yard, do not go deal with it. Like, you can talk to them if you want. Do not go onto your neighbor's property and start ripping up plants. Like, do not do that. For so many reasons, don't do that. It is a never-ending battle, and that's not to sound pessimistic or anything like that. It is a constant battle dealing with invasive species, and especially with Florida being such a beacon for different invasive species, not even just on land either. You've got lionfish and nasty stuff in the waters as well. So what do you think are some of the, I know it can vary from species to species, but what are some of those telltale signs that you might have a bit of a problem with an invasive species?
For plants, I tell people if there's a plant that you don't recognize and all of a sudden it's just everywhere, check it out. Right? There's not a lot of native things that just absolutely take over areas. There's a few, but if it's a native that takes over an area, typically people, at least people that are land managers and out and about in the woods, they're going to know what that is, right? Sweet gum. I mean, everyone knows what a sweet gum is. If it's something you don't recognize that is taken over, that's not a great start, to be honest with you. That's kind of the biggest thing for plants. And for insects and fungi, we always tell land managers or homeowners, if it looks just weird or off, trust your intuition. And in this day and age, it is really easy to send in pictures. So to let extension professionals or state agency folks figure out what's going on and maybe make an early diagnosis. We've got the Southern Forest Health Diagnostics Facebook page where we ask people to put pictures of their issues on, and we can solve most of these just online. And it also gives us a chance to sort of weed out, well, this is this, and some of these we might want to go visit that one. But I think the best advice I've got for people is take pictures of things that don't look right to you and let one of your extension professionals from whatever state you're in, let them help you. That's what we're there for. That's our job. And picture's worth 1,000 words. In the old days, when I was younger, it was a phone call and someone had to drive out there and physically look at it. But we are beyond that now. So those pictures are quite good. Some close-ups, some far away ones, and we can typically tell what's going on.
So I'm not a formally trained entomologist or mycologist. So when we're thinking about invasive insects or invasive fungi, is it sort of a similar situation where if something just doesn't look right, if it looks out of place? Because I wouldn't be able to distinguish between fungi to save my life.
Mm-hmm.
Insects to a certain degree, maybe there's a lot of dead trees or something like that. Some doesn't seem right. But in your experience, are there other things that might be red flags for somebody to look out for?
It's usually if there's mortality or damage that happens fast. That can be a red flag too. If something's going to happen really, really fast. If it was what looked to be a very healthy tree that all of a sudden just died, most trees die slowly, and they'll start to lose some leaves, lose some needles, lose some branches, a piece of bark will fall off, but it takes a while, right? Months, years. If you've got a situation where you've got that great, that healthy, beautiful oak in your front yard, and within 2-3 weeks it is just all brown, that's not normal, right? So the speed at which some of these things happen to me is a pretty good key. Fast means check it out. It doesn't mean for sure it's an invasive species in there, but it means it's worth checking out for sure. And then beyond that, it's the scale, right? If you've got 50 acres and all of a sudden 40 acres is dead, you're going to want to get that looked at for sure, right? So scale and speed kind of tell you what kind of pest you are likely dealing with.
Gotcha. And then similar point, relying on extension and perhaps other institutions for help with identification and diagnosis.
Yeah, and I always tell people, well, I hope everyone pays their taxes, but assuming you pay taxes, right, you have already paid for the cooperative extension. We are all state-funded entities, so use what you've paid for, right? That's our job, is to do this stuff.
It's great that you mentioned the cooperative extension, just because that's just one of many resources, right? And this podcast is also an extension product, but this isn't certainly not a diagnostic tool. So in Florida, for example, we have the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. There's some great people working there that do a lot of stuff with different beetles, fungi, all sorts of interesting stuff. And if you're not in Florida, there are certainly, each state has their own version of their Department of Agriculture and whatnot. Certainly the university system, the land-grant university system, to be a little bit more specific. There's plenty of groups online. I say that with a bit of an asterisk. Just be mindful of, you might be interacting with all sorts of people on social media, so maybe not everything will be the most accurate. But all that to say is there are certainly plenty of resources for some sort of assistance, either formally or informally. So, Dave, I think that's pretty much a wrap. Thank you for being here and for the lively discussion. I know that some of these conversations could go for hours and hours and hours, and so I'm very grateful for you to be here for the 40 minutes or so that we've been doing this. But if you have anything else you'd like to add, this is your chance.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Appreciate you having me on. Just one follow up on the online thing. Like Tyler mentioned, be careful. There's a lot of stuff out there, but make sure you're using a reputable source. And so all of our state, in the Southeast at least, all of our state agencies have official channels. There's always a way to reach someone with your state Department of Ag, your state Forestry Commission, your state Department of Natural Resources. Those should be your trusted information sources for whatever state you are in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Be on the lookout for invasive species and be mindful of the scale and speed formula as proposed by Dr. Dave Coyle from Clemson University. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. For more information, head on over to the Proforest website at proforesthealth.org. For any questions you may have, or to stay updated on all things Proforest, check out our social media at ProforestUF on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Episode hosted by Dr. Tyler Carney. This podcast was edited by Ben Ginkars Davies. The Proforest Podforest is brought to you by Proforest, Proactive Forest Health and Resilience at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.